Well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Life, Love, God, the autobiography of Norman Paulson, who was a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 4, School and the Strange Encounter. And I think you're going to enjoy this chapter, particularly if you read the whole chapter, because as I've said before, I'm not reading this book to you. What we're going over are some highlights from the chapter and some of the spiritual ramifications of what Norm experienced in his life. And so the last slide on this series today will give you instructions on how you can get your own copy of Life, Love, God. So in this chapter, Brother Norm is beginning school. He's age 6 and he's about to turn 7. And this is a cute little picture of him dressed like a young cowboy. But I want to remind you that prior to this age 6 that he's at, Norm has already experienced samadhi in his backyard. He's already remembered some of his previous incarnations. He's received a blessing from his father's spiritual teacher, Jin Chao. And he's been experiencing visions and dreams about a teacher with dark eyes. So I don't know what you were like when you were 6 years old or what you were doing at age of 6, but I was thinking about my own life. At age 6, I was drawing pictures of airplanes in aerial battles. I was building forts in the woods. Saturday morning, I was watching Roy Rogers and Sky King, Tarzan and the Lone Ranger on television, and during the day, I was putting playing cards in the spokes of my bicycle to make that funny noise, or picking wild blackberries, or trying to catch birds by propping up a cardboard box with a stick and a long string. I didn't have very deep thoughts, but as you look at what Norm was thinking about at age 6, Norm was different. Norm was advanced. Norm was way beyond the consciousness of me, who was a normal 6-year-old. Norm was an extraordinary 6-year-old. So let's talk about photographic memory for a minute, because it goes into one of the experiences that Norm had here. And a good example of photographic memory, or what we call eidetic memory, was Swami Vivekananda. And there's a story of Vivekananda. He used to go to the library every day and he'd check out a book, and then the next morning he'd bring the book back and check out another book. And, one of the things that happened to him was a librarian finally said, "I don't think you're really reading these books." And Vivekananda said to the person, he said, "Well, if you doubt that I'm reading these books, why don't you test me on these books?" And the librarian began to test Swami on these books, and not only could he recite the books word for word, but he could tell you what page they were on. So Vivekananda explained in his teachings that when a child begins to read, he learns to read one letter at a time. You remember that. You'd have a couple of letters and you'd see a C or a K and you'd be going k, 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 cookie, or like that. And when he reads that way, his whole attention is on a single letter. Gradually, as the child grows up and with practice, you begin to scan a single word at a time, or 2 to 3 words at a time. And likewise, if he goes on increasing his concentration power, he'd be able to read an entire page of the book at a glance. That's what speed reading is all about. So here's a quote from Vivekananda. "One has to read with full attention, concentration, and one must not fritter away that energy that one draws from their food." Interesting thought. But the core of that idea is that memory is a product of a person's power of concentration. So this brings us to the first story in this chapter, and that's Norm's first day of school. And Norm comes home all excited with one of his school books, and he says, "Dad, I want to learn how to read like the teacher does." "Listen, Dad, I can almost read some now." So he brought home his school book, and after dinner, he sat down with his mom and his dad, and they tested him. And Norm described the scene like this. As I turned the first page, I instantly remembered sitting with all the other children. I could see the teacher again as she read from the book, and I started repeating the words she had spoken. By the way, word for word and turning the pages at exactly the right time. They were so astonished, and his mother had him taken to Santa Barbara and tested by a doctor there. And later she received offers for Norm to appear for demonstrations, probably with the PTA or the Alpha Club or one of the things that she was involved with, and also to undergo scientific study. But Norm's father would have none of that. He said, he is going to live a normal, natural life as long as I have anything to say about it. So here we are. Charles knew that his son was destined for something great, and that he did not want his son being held up as unnatural or unusual or being made a spectacle of or something like that. He was very protective of Norman. So another story that comes out of this chapter is the Christmas tree. Now remember, he's only 6 years old. And this was in 1935. Norm was sitting looking at a tree, a Christmas tree, and he sensed, this is how he worded, he sensed the true meaning of Christmas and the Christmas tree. In later years, he would describe the tree as the outer image of man's inner tree of life, the central nervous system, and that the colored lights that depicted the chakras. The star on top symbolized the first creation of light, the Christ light, crowning the tree of life. So for those of you that haven't been to our lodge at Christmas time, be aware that every year we decorate our lodge Christmas tree to match Norm's description, with the colors of the chakras moving up the tree to putting a star on the very top of the tree. Norm, and this was pretty funny, Norm also knew that when Santa Claus made the special visit to the Paulson home that year, he realized it was his own father, especially when he knew his dad wasn't in the house and his mother had to take Santa Claus by the arm and lead him to the front door because Charles was blind and he probably couldn't see. He couldn't work his way around with wearing a beard and the Santa hat. So Norm got quite a kick out of that. So Norm's father, Charles, played the piano for the silent films at that time at the Lompoc Theater. And you can see a picture of the Lompoc Theater. It looks like from the 1930s or 40s. The first movie that Norm ever saw in the theater was Tarzan of the Apes. It was a silent version. And while all the other children were watching the big screen and exclaiming, "Wow, there's Tarzan!" Norman turned back and looked at the brilliant light blazing from the rear of the theater, from the projector, and he realized it was light that was producing all the images he was seeing on the screen. And he realized that the images he could create on his own screen, meaning through his third eye, with his imagination, while listening to his father's story, or stories, produced incredibly more to look at. The movie was an outward demonstration of what he was already doing with his imagination, creating images on his inward screen. So here we already have Norm understanding some basic ideas that go along with Kriya Yoga meditation. But remember, he's only 6 years old. So here's the story that really makes this chapter important. Nana took Norman to the Lompoc Library, which today is the History Museum in Lompoc. But in those days, it was built from a grant by the Carnegie Foundation, and it was called the Carnegie Library. And he was there to check out his first book. So while Norm was there, he felt this inner stimulation of familiarity, as he worded it. His senses were straining in anticipation of something inspired by his intuition. In other words, something was about to happen and he could feel it. So he went to the children's section and he was overwhelmed by all the choices of books that he could read. But his awareness was feeling something and it was pulling him. And as that pulling sensation exerted on him, he followed that energy that he felt through the tall bookshelves to the end of the room where he saw a stairway. Now, here's a picture of the stairway in that old Lompoc library. And he descended to the bottom of the stairs and he found a single open doorway and looked inside. Lighted by a single window, a robed, hooded figure sat at the table. The figure rose silently and turned toward me. I was startled and apprehensive, as any 6-year-old might be. And here's how Norm worded the interchange between him and this strange visitor. From the depths of the hood, a very old man's face looked at me in silence. His robe was of fine white substance, like wool. A single belt of the same material fastened at his waist. Picking up a small leather-bound book which lay before him, the figure stepped back, and without his lips moving, I heard him say, "Come in, Norman." I hesitated. Then he took a step toward me, holding out the book. "It's yours, Norman. Take it. It belongs to you. Christ's New Testament." So, what was this book? And who was this strange hooded visitor? And was it actually the New Testament that he was holding in his hand? Well, I don't know, but as I've meditated about this, I think this was a visitation from this hooded stranger, that Norm would have a significant role in bringing back the true essence of the Christian religion to the Western world. Much of that had been lost over the years, and what had been lost primarily was man's ability to experience God one-on-one. And so, who was this hooded visitor? Well, we don't know yet, because in this chapter he's not named. But this hooded visitor weaves in and out of Norman's life. So pretty close, maybe a year later or so, Nana, his grandmother, takes Norman to Sunday school. So Norman was asking questions to a Sunday school teacher, and he asked a really difficult question for a Sunday school teacher, and the answer didn't please him. So when he got home from Sunday school that day, he told his father, "I don't want to go anymore." And his father said, "Why?" He said, "Because nobody there really knows what they're talking about." And that expression makes me smile when I hear it, because we're talking about probably a 6, 7, 8-year-old child here. And suddenly, as he says this, he sees the image of the hooded figure in his mind's eye, and he hears the voice again. "You must walk in a circle, Norman, around the outside of the church. You will then understand all men and their beliefs." It's like, wait a second. What is this hooded stranger telling him to do? He wants him to go back to the church and walk around it? No, I don't know. As I've meditated about this, I think that this probably was metaphorical. Anyway, I think that what the strange hooded figure was telling him was, the answers to the questions you're asking are not going to be found inside of a church. The church has lost that understanding. And so basically he's telling him, you're going to have to look elsewhere, Norman. It's not going to be there in Sunday school class. So more of the hooded stranger. He appears later. So Norman now has grown up. He's entered Mount Washington. Yogananda has passed away, so he's left Mount Washington and the desert where he was living, and returned to the Lompoc, Santa Barbara area, where he got a job with Johns Manville, which is the company that does all that white diatomaceous earth in the hills around Lompoc. And he was staying in a hotel there in Lompoc, and he awoke one night in his hotel room in very severe pain. So severe he was going in and out of consciousness. And suddenly, a brilliant light appeared. It was like a flash of light, and Norman felt a presence around him. And it spoke. "I am Melchizedek. You must get up and call your father. Come with me now." So Norm was not in shape to go from his room down the stairs to the lobby of the hotel to make this phone call. And he didn't know who Melchizedek was, but the presence of this spirit, this hooded figure in front of him, gave Norm new strength. And he finally got downstairs and made the phone call to his father. Then he passed out again. He woke up in the hospital, and the doctors told him that he had acute appendicitis and that they were going to have to operate. And Norm said, I don't want to be operated on. And then he heard the voice speak to him again. Tell them to do another test. There will be no operation. Norm sent a mental image to Melchizedek, thanking him for the healing, because that had what happened. He'd been healed by this hooded figure, and he'd also mentioned that he was Melchizedek. And so he asked him, are you the same person that appeared to me in the library when I was 6 years old? And the answer was, yes, I and that figure are one and the same. So we don't know much about Melchizedek. He was a prophet and a leader. He was king of Salem, which is another word of saying Jerusalem. And we do know that Abraham and Melchizedek lived at the same time, and Abraham paid tithing to Melchizedek, indicating that Melchizedek had a higher priesthood authority than even Abraham. It's interesting that in 1945, when they dug up the Nag Hammadi library, it contains a book of Melchizedek, and it seems to indicate, according to the people that wrote the Nag Hammadi library, that he may have been an earlier incarnation of Jesus. Well, we don't really know. But who was Melchizedek to Norman? So the question I've asked myself in meditation, and trust me, I haven't got an answer to this yet, but was Melchizedek assigned to watch over Norm during his life? And what was special about Norm that basically a previous incarnated spiritual leader would be watching over him, somewhat like an angel? Was Norm a disciple of Melchizedek in a previous incarnation? Or was his companionship a little of both? That he was watching over Norm and Norm had been a disciple? I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to that question until we pass to the other side. But it's interesting, as I think about this, in 1948, the same time period in which Norman joined Yogananda at Mount Washington, as well as many other of his more renowned disciples, Yogananda had a samadhi that summer that lasted, I think it was 2 or 3 days. And during that samadhi, he was in direct communication with God as Divine Mother. And the sisters, the nuns, were able to write down what Yogananda was asking of Divine Mother, and they were also able to write down, because Divine Mother was speaking through Yogananda, they were able to write down Divine Mother's answers. And one of the things that Yogananda asked is, Divine Mother, why have I had so much difficulty with my disciples? They come and they go, and Divine Mother said, I sent you a few bad ones in the beginning, but to test your love for me. But now, meaning 1948, 1949, but now I'm sending you angels, and whoever smites them, I shall smite. So I believe that Brother Norm was one of those angels, and that Melchizedek had been assigned to basically overlook the progress of Norman during his life, to help him when he really needed help and guidance. But that's my projection. That's not necessarily fact, but someday we'll know the answer to this. Anyway, I hope you had an enjoyable time with this chapter. Please read it in its entirety. It's a powerful chapter. And we'll see you for our next episode. Here's how to order your copy of Life, Love, God. And our next month, we're going to talk about Chapter 5, My Search Begins for the Face of God.